Hello, wrestling fans, and welcome to the sixth, I can't believe I'm saying, sixth volume of Step Through the Ropes. In 1991, when Nature Boy Ric Flair left WCW for the World Wrestling Federation, to me it was the shocker of a lifetime. Throughout the 1980s, Flair was Mr. NWA and basically carried the company on his shoulder throughout that whole decade, to the point where Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine declared him Wrestler of the Decade in the 1980s. But in 1991, when Ric Flair decided to bolt from WCW for the World Wrestling Federation, it was quite a shock to me as a fan back in those days when I was tuning into WCW Pro Wrestling, which aired Saturday mornings on Channel 11. And during the regular broadcast, we see an interruption by Tony Schiavone saying that after extensive negotiations had failed with Ric Flair, that the WCW World Heavyweight Championship was vacant. Well, eventually finding out the story, it was quite a shocking ordeal. It turns out that Ric Flair, I understand, had been working without a contract for like a good year. And at the same time, the company was at the time run by Jim Herd, who in a previous Step Through the Ropes video I referred to as Jim Turd, who didn't know shit about wrestling, and that there was a falling out in the situation. But it all kind of began in 1990, where both Flair and Herd promised Sting the World Heavyweight Championship. Well, on a Clash of Champions, Flair, Arn Anderson, and Ole Anderson had kicked Sting out of the Four Horsemen. Later that night, Ole replaced Sting in a six-man cage match against the Great Muta, and I forgot who his partners were. Flair and the Andersons were booed heavily by the crowd due to what they did to Sting earlier in the show. Sting tried to come out and climb the cage, and I don't know if it was from climbing up or down the cage where Sting got injured, and he was scheduled to face Flair at the Wrestle War 1990 pay-per-view, but due to the injury, Sting could not do the show, and then Herd decided to go back on his promise to Sting and wanted Flair to put the world title on Lex Luger, which Flair refused because he gave his promised Sting the championship, and he was going to wait for Sting to heal up and then put the belt on him. That's where the problems with Flair and Jim Herd actually began. Well, we know in the summer of 1990, Flair did live up to his promise. He put the top, as he was defeated by Sting at the Great American Bash pay-per-view. And Jim Herd tried to phase Flair out of the world title / main event picture after that, because Flair teamed with Arn Anderson in a failed attempt to win the tag team championship from Doom at Halloween Havoc. And due to a brain fart that failed by Ole Anderson, who came up with the Black Scorpion, Flair had volunteered to turn out to be the Scorpion at Starrcade 1990. And then, in 1991, at a house show at the Meadowlands Arena, which we know today is the Izod Center, Flair defeated Sting to win the world title back. And the kicker to the whole thing is that Herd, who again didn't know anything about wrestling, Herd wanted Ric Flair to shave his head and to start wrestling as Spartacus. My understanding that Kevin Sullivan, when Kevin Sullivan heard news about that, he said, yeah, while we're at it, let's change Mickey Mantle's number. So it shows you what Jim Herd didn't know what the fuck what he was doing. Eventually, the Herd wanted Flair to put the WCW World Championship on Lex Luger at the Great American Bash 1991 pay-per-view, because many times from 1988 to 90, Luger had so many opportunities to unseat Flair, and he failed for one reason or another, because either Flair would cheat or Flair would get disqualified, or I'm sure the backstage politics and gaga, all that other stuff came into play too. All right? But the kicker was Flair wouldn't do the honors for Luger. Flair offered to drop the title to Barry Windham at a WCW Saturday night taping at Center Stage Theater in Atlanta, and instead Jim Herd said no, and he was going to send Doug Dillinger to come pick up the championship belt. Now, the problem with this was, of course, at that time, the NWA championships were rebranded WCW championships, and I understand the old school way of the old NWA board of directors was that prior to appointing someone NWA world champion, that individual would have to put down a deposit of $25,000. And over time, that wrestler would get the money back plus interest. Well, I guess as of 1991, Flair had not received the money back and said he was not giving the belt back to Doug Dillinger, giving it to Doug Dillinger so he could take it to back to the company. So in the process, I don't know if Flair had quit on WCW or Herd fired Flair. And my understanding, because Flair was gone from WCW, Lex Luger ended up defeating Barry Windham in that steel cage match to win the vacant World Heavyweight Championship. In the meantime, Flair apparently decided, since the belt was his, he contacted Vince McMahon about wanting to to jump ship, and Flair also told him that he's got the belt. So Bobby the Brain Heenan won one episode of, I don't know if it was Superstars or Wrestling Challenge. He had the belt in his hands and announced that Ric Flair was coming to the WWF, and I couldn't believe it when he mentioned his name. When I remember watching it as a teenager at the time and couldn't believe that Flair, Mr. NWA, was coming. It was, kind of like a little different from seeing your favorite baseball player playing for a different team. The point is, Flair, I understand, when he jumped ship, he signed a 2-year contract with the WWF in 1991. And Flair was set to make his Superstars debut, but about, I don't know how many weeks prior to that, Heenan was on the funeral parlor with Paul Bearer, and the late Roddy Piper left the broadcast table, and he ended up spitting on the belt. He spit in Heenan's face, and Piper said the next time he spits, it would be on Flair. So Flair was going to make his debut on Superstars of Wrestling, and Flair comes over to the table, and he attacks Piper, and they start a bit of a program on house shows in the fall of 1991. Also in 1991, Flair began doing house shows against Hulk Hogan, which, by understanding, the houses were not drawing for some weird reason. Now, by the end of 1991, they went on television. We were wondering, why was the World Championship being censored on WWF telecasts? Well, they claimed that the late Jack Tunney, who was the on-air president at the time, they said that Flair was told not to wear the belt anymore, and they didn't know where he got it from. But they decided they were going to video distort the championship belt if he ever wore it. Well, the reason behind this is that by the end of 1991, Flair gave the belt back to the National Wrestling Alliance, and the reason they censored the belt is because Flair would bring a WWF Tag Team belt, championship belt, with him that got video distorted, censored, covered up on television. Flair, of course, was the sole survivor of his Survivor Series match, where he joined forces with Ted DiBiase, the Mountie, and the Warlord over Roddy Piper, Davey Boy Smith, Bret Hart, and Virgil. Later that night, Flair would assist The Undertaker, defeating Hulk Hogan for the WWF World title. Flair tried to intervene in the Hogan-Undertaker rematch at the Tuesday Night in Texas pay-per-view, but it all backfired. Then, 1992 arrived, and, what I forgot to mention, by the time Survivor Series rolled around, Flair had the late Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig as his executive consultant in his corner. What happened was 1992 arrived, and the Royal Rumble match was going to crown a new world champion due to the vacancy left after Hogan beat The Undertaker at the Tuesday night in Texas pay-per-view. Well, Flair, despite entering the Royal Rumble match third, wound up winning the Royal Rumble match and became the WWF champion. And then Flair was going to face Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8, but then changes were made. Flair was going to face Macho Man Randy Savage for the world title, while Hogan ended up wrestling Sid Justice. To add fuel to the fire of the title match, Flair was claiming he had a previous affair or relationship with Miss Elizabeth, and had claimed he had photographic proof in WWF magazines. Turned out the whole thing was untrue, as the pictures were fraudulent or doctored. And it turned out those were actually pictures of Elizabeth and Randy Savage in their personal moments or private times and such. Eventually, Savage unseated Flair for the WWF title at WrestleMania 8, and throughout the spring and summer, Flair failed to win the belt in previous matches. Then, in another great ploy or storyline, Savage was set to face the Ultimate Warrior at Wembley Stadium at SummerSlam 92 for the world title. Both Flair and Mr. Perfect were claiming that Savage and Warrior were like plotting with Mr. Perfect for the SummerSlam match. The match takes place, and during the match, both Flair and Perfect come out together, and they ended up doing a number on Savage, and it turned out that Perfect, who kept saying he was going to be in the winner's corner in the weeks leading up to that pay-per-view, turned out he was with Flair all that time. Sticking with Flair all that time, I should say. Just days after that pay-per-view was taped, mind you, it was taped, it was over in London, England. It was taped 2 days before it actually aired. But a few days after the show took place, at a taping in Hershey, Pennsylvania, Flair defeated Savage to regain the WWF World title thanks to interference by Razor Ramon. Now, prior to Flair signing the contract, there was a clause placed in the contract that if Flair could not be in the main event title picture, he could get out of his contract with the WWF. So during Flair's second time as WWF champion, he had suffered some type of an injury to his eardrum, and he, I guess, called out Vince McMahon on that clause. Because what happened was Flair ended up dropping the world title to Bret the Hitman Hart in Saskatchewan, Canada. Say that 3 times fast. And that resulted in, there was all other choices to put the title on were the Ultimate Warrior and Tito Santana at the time, surprisingly. They went with Bret Hart, and also prior to the Survivor Series pay-per-view, where Flair and Razor Ramon were set to face Savage and the Warrior in a tag team match. Unfortunately, Warrior had been fired for failing a drug test after a Saturday Night's Main Event in Terre Haute, Indiana, I believe. That was the one where Shawn Michaels defeated Davey Boy Smith. Davey was also fired for failing a drug test after that. It's where Shawn beat Davey Boy Smith for the Intercontinental title, and Warrior and Savage had beaten Money Incorporated by countout at that very Saturday Night's Main Event taping, which aired in mid-November 1992. So, because Warrior was gone, I wouldn't be surprised if this was hot-shotted. I'm probably using the wrong term, because I'm sure eventually down the road there was talk of Flair and Mr. Perfect having a little feud or a program, because Perfect was getting back in the ring. And on an episode of Primetime Wrestling, Savage said he wanted to name Mr. Perfect to be his partner, and throughout that show Flair and Ramon were kind of putting Perfect down, and Ramon saying, "Oh, you used to be somebody. Oh, now you work for us." And even Bobby Heenan was sitting right next to Perfect, was saying, "Listen, you host Primetime with me. You host Superstars with McMahon," and trying to convince him to stay where he's at as a broadcaster and as Flair's executive consultant. By the end of that Primetime episode, Perfect got tired of everybody talking, and he accepted Savage's offer to be his partner, and pretty much sealed the deal. He had become a babyface by grabbing Bobby Heenan by the tie and pouring water over his head. By the way, Flair and Ramon lost that match by disqualification at the Survivor Series 1992 pay-per-view. And basically, for the rest of late 92 and up to early 93, Flair was doing house shows with Mr. Perfect, which culminated in a career-ending match in January of 1993, where Perfect defeated Flair, and it just so happened Flair was on his way back to WCW because he had gotten out of that contract, as I mentioned. But looking back on the situation, what would have happened if Jim Herd had actually known wrestling? What would have happened if Flair didn't leave and did the honors? Would Flair have done the honors for Lex Luger in 1991? What if Flair never came to the WWF and had that awesome run from fall 91 to early 93? Well, you could leave your comments, let me know what you think of this video, and I don't know. I mean, of course, who could forget the late Bobby Heenan saying, "Oh, if you want to be fair to Flair." That was kind of tough to say long ago. And basically, let me know what you think of it. I mean, should Flair have done the honors for Luger? Should he have done the honors for Barry Windham? Should he have stayed with WCW and stuck it out? What would have happened if Flair didn't leave the WWF in 93? I mean, what would have happened would Flair possibly walk into WrestleMania 9 as world champion? Again, leave your comments and let me know what you all think.